I'm Paul Breeden. I'm the Treasurer of the Bristol branch of the National Union of Journalists.
There's cost of living strikes going on across the UK. Are there other factors behind the strike for Reach plc journalists?
Well, the cost of living is a major factor. Journalists are not well paid, despite what people might think, but they are feeling at their wits' end. They feel overworked and underappreciated. They're working hours and hours beyond the time that they're supposed to, and they're seeing no reward for it. And the fact that their chief executive is taking home £4 million this year and is personally refusing to countenance anything above 3% for his staff has got them really, really angry.
Journalists' salaries are notoriously low at the moment. Has it always been this way?
It's not been as bad as this. It really has reached rock bottom now. Salaries are probably the same as they were 10 years ago, and in some cases have probably declined. And when journalists become experienced and get into middle age and older like me, very often they are laid off before they retire because they become too expensive.
So, do we know why they're so low at the moment?
That's a complicated question, but Reach is the biggest local newspaper company in the country, as well as owning national titles, The Star, Express and The Mirror, and so it sets an example for the rest, and what it can get away with, others can too. Unfortunately, journalism is a profession that attracts people who are very dedicated, and that makes them less likely to make a fuss and more likely to put up with unfair paying conditions. But in the current economic circumstances, what they're being offered just isn't enough to even to pay rent. There's a lot of irony in the fact that in Bristol, where rents are really high and it's quite expensive to live, journalists are being asked to write stories about how they can't afford to pay their rent and have a decent life.
With the strikes bringing the issue of pay into the public minds, do you think the public will be surprised at how little journalists are paid?
I think they will. I think many people probably assume journalism is a very well paid profession, approaching the pay of teachers or nurses or the police, and it's just not. It used to be, but as I said, wages have ground down over the last 20, particularly the last 10 years. So much so that some members who work for Reach tell us that they're having to resort to food banks, which is an appalling situation. Of course, many other working people have to use food banks as well, and there shouldn't be any shame in it. But it's not something you expect from a well-established, a very profitable industry like journalism.
Does that low pay and the fact that people are having to use food banks, is that going to affect the quality of journalism?
Not directly, because as I say, I think journalists are very dedicated. What it does mean is that journalists burn out very quickly and they find they can't afford to continue. 14 journalists, we believe, working in this building behind me for Reach, have left the company in the past year. Many of them after only a year in the job. There's a huge turnover, and whereas people used to stick around for 2 or 3 years on a regional title at least, they are now typically lasting a year, because they know that even the lowest paid jobs in public relations, even for charities, are going to pay them more, when actually we know they would probably rather be involved in the cut and thrust of news. But people can't afford to have a family on a journalist's wage. They can't afford to rent a decent place. It's incredibly difficult to see how a journalist, or even a couple who are journalists, could afford a mortgage in Bristol.
There's some stats about how many journalists come from sort of middle class, upper middle class families, and the fact that it's inaccessible to people of colour, women, those with disabilities. Do you think that this is one of those factors that plays into that?
This is a real worry. Journalism has got more and more middle class, a middle class profession, and one for affluent people and people with connections. That's got worse over the last 10 years, and this can only accentuate that trend. There's actually been a lot of good work at Bristol Live, at the Bristol Post, and at places like Bristol 24/7 and Bristol Cable to make sure that diversity is increased. But if people can't afford to do the job, then it's going to become the preserve once again of those who've got rich parents who can afford to let them work for, give them rent free, and people who've got connections who can find them a job.
And is this situation at Reach indicative of journalism and journalist pay as a whole?
Sadly, it is in the regions, because Reach is by far the biggest owner of regional titles. It owns most of those here in the southwest, and a majority across the country. And so they set an example which the other companies will feel they can follow.